Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Manage Supplier Risk and Build a More Resilient Supply Chain. We're excited you could join us. My name is Annie Falcone, and I'll be moderating today's event. Today, we are going to deep dive on how supply chains have evolved dramatically throughout the past 10 years. Geopolitical tensions, climate change, and technological advancement have been and will continue to be the main drivers of change over the next 10 years. These drivers are ultimately unavoidable, and successful organizations must understand and respond to these changes as part of their supply chain planning and execution. We are thrilled to be joined by our speakers, Ilya Levtov, co-founder and CEO of Craft, Vijay Natarajan, Digital Supply Chain Strategy Leader and Managing Director of Deloitte Consulting, and Abhinit Lekhi, Global Illuminate and Supply Horizon Solutions Lead and Partner, Deloitte Consulting. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping items. Please note the slides will advance automatically throughout the presentation. To enlarge the slides, you can click the Enlarge Slides button located in the top right corner of your presentation window. If you need technical assistance, click on the Help widget located on the bottom left corner of your console. And we encourage you to submit questions at any time throughout the presentation using the Q&A widget at the bottom of your console. We will try to answer these during the webcast, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. And please know we do capture all your questions. All right, I'm going to hand it on over to Ilya, so take it away.
Thank you so much, Annie. Hello, everyone. Delighted to be here with you and with Vijay and Abhi from Deloitte. And we've got an exciting discussion to share with you, as Annie said, about how supply chains have evolved over the last decade and what's coming in the next decade, particularly with a perspective around risk and resilience. So let's start with you, Abhi. I wonder if I can ask you, fill in for us in a bit more detail, how exactly have supply chains evolved and transformed over the last decade? And what are the kind of additional or new risks that we've seen evolving in supply chain management as a result of those changes?
Yeah, hey Ilya, how are you? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm dialing in from Australia here, so it's morning for us. Also delighted to be here. And thanks for that question. It's a good one. Look, first, when we cover that topic, we've got to think about how supply chains have changed over the last decade. And once we think about that, then we can talk about what new risks are a problem and how we have to think about those, right? So, you know, in the last decade before the COVID pandemic, the focus in supply chain management was all about efficiency, right? It was all about supply chains was something that just worked. And we have to focus on making them more efficient every single day, right? You think of concepts like lean manufacturing and similar concepts, and it was all about how do we take cost out of our supply chain. What that meant over the last decade was that efficiency often came at the expense of resilience, right? So the supply chains got progressively more efficient. We took more and more cost out. But that meant that there was a disproportionate effect on resilience going down, right? And this focus on efficiency, what it really led to is it drove some very specialized global hubs in our supply networks, right? And so if we think about, for example, electronics, which is an easy one and most people know about, you think Asia, Southeast Asia, and a lot of our electronics come from that part of the world. There are similar hubs all over the world that are set up. And one small disruption in any of these hubs can lead to quite a significant impact on supply networks all over the globe. It's a bit of a ripple effect, right? And so, you know, as we think about what that's meant, now we have to think about what risks could impact those supply chains. So one impact in one part of the world that's important, like we saw with semiconductors and Taiwan and China, you start to see a disruption in supply networks of many, many products all over the world, right? And so the types of risks that now we really have to think about is one little weather event in one part of the world can have a ripple effect, right? So we know our environment is changing and the impact of certain weather events is more, we're seeing these more often and potentially more prolonged, and they have a bigger impact, right? So as our environment changes, those are one of the risks now that we have to be far more aware of and managed that we didn't necessarily have to worry about because our supply chains were more disaggregated across the world, right? I would say the second one that we often see be quite a topic of interest for organizations is the geopolitical environment. So the environment's changing, that's number one. So keeping an eye on how that impacts supply chains is probably most important, and we're seeing that as one of the greatest impacts. The geopolitical environment would be a close second in our opinion, right? So you see lots of different events playing out around the world that you never would have in the last 24 months. Things have happened on the geopolitical front that we wouldn't have necessarily expected in the year before that, right? And so as these events play out, we're starting to see how they disrupt supply chains. And most organizations are not necessarily ready to respond to these, right? And then there's many, many others. But if I was to leave you with a top three, the third one that's on my mind and that we see quite often is cyber threats, right? What are the impacts of cyber threats in our supply chains, and not just at our companies and not just our direct suppliers, but our suppliers and their suppliers and so on, and how could they impact critical infrastructure and critical products around the world? Ilya, I'll stop there. There's many more I could go into, but if I was to give you a top three, those would be the three on my mind.
100%. Yeah. Climate, geopolitics, cyber. Yes, Vijay, anything you would add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, going back to how supply chains of today, right, are different, two things that come to mind and underscore maybe what Abhi said around globalization and complexity of the supply chains. It's really now understanding your sub-tiers and where the choke points are in your supply chain is becoming more important. That's number one. And number two, supply chain relationship or supply relationship management has become extremely important. How can you directly interact with the choke points to share information like supply and demand, to share information around operational visibility, so that you can proactively prepare and collaboratively address any ripple effects that Abhi talked about that comes through the supply chain. Those two are extremely important. I think he nailed all the future risks that we're going to see.
Fantastic. So it's really about surfacing information and visibility and a line of communication to where you've discovered your critical issue might be. Tremendous. Okay.
Before we move on, Ilya, I'm going to take my top three and make it a top four, and this is important. I apologize for butting in there, but there's a fourth risk that's not necessarily disrupting your supply chain day to day, but it's a very important one for organizations to be across, and that is the risk of modern slavery across our supply chains. So you may not see modern slavery impact your supply chain day in, day out. However, what we're seeing is that that's a really more prevalent issue than we have historically seen, because organizations are now becoming aware. And so you need to look for that modern slavery across your extended supply chain, as Vijay said, across the sub-tiers, and have some visibility and a plan of action of how to minimize that or completely remove that from your supply chain, right? But in a way that doesn't necessarily remove suppliers, but helps those suppliers implement the right practices.
And I would say, Abhi, that's becoming even regulatory driven, right? I mean, different regions are now, like, for example, in the US, you have the UFLPA Act that is requiring companies to understand who all the sub-tier suppliers are. And if there are some unethical practices, they need to actually resource and essentially, correct their supply chain, if you will. So.
Absolutely. And I know that in Europe, there are very significant fines already. Percentage of revenue can be levied for enterprises found in violation of those acts. So glad you added that dimension risk there, Abhi. And there's two aspects to it. There's the ethics, right, as Vijay just mentioned, and then there's the compliance and the potential costs that enterprises face there. Tremendous. Okay, so next topic, Vijay, I know that first in 2021 and then updating last year in 23, Deloitte conducted a very comprehensive survey across chief procurement officers and supply chain leaders. Can you share with us what were some of the key findings there with respect to supply chain resilience?
Yeah, absolutely. So we conduct these surveys every 2 years with global CPOs. And really what came to light in the 2021 and 2023 survey is how important resilience has become a topic, along with potentially sustainability and efficiency. So really, everyone's trying to balance all the three aspects so that a strategic mindset is built around how do you build resilient and agile supply chain along with efficiency. With that said, the reason that there's so much focus on supply chain resilience is because of the impact, ever since the pandemic. And if you look at these global and complex supply chains, the impact was significant. Like there was significant lost sales. I worked with an OEM where one of their flagship products contributed 75% of their profits, and a stoppage to that bled 1 million a day in losses, right? So that is huge. And just not having a resilient and agile supply chain crippled them for months, and they were unable to respond. Second, cost impacts, expedited freight. Third, lost brand and trust. I mean, so not having a resilient supply chain can be debilitating to your business, if you will. So what did we find through the survey? High performers, 95% of them have very high visibility into their tier ones, where they have very good exchange of information around supply demand. They've got visibility 6 months, 1 year down in terms of their ability to fulfill orders, and proactively they can sort of seek any mismatches and proactively address them with them. They're also twice as likely to have good visibility into the tier 2 plus supply chain. And so that is one finding. Next, what we found is enhanced supplier information sharing is the top supply risk mitigation strategy. And this goes all the way from sharing information during the sourcing process around who your value stream map suppliers are that are supplying into your plants, setting up sort of long-term service agreements, not only with the tier ones, but the sub-tiers that may be choke points, and then going into when it's operational, sharing operational visibility around supply demand, sharing inventory positions, and the like. So that has been enabled significantly by technology in a way that can be exchanged real time, and that allows them to collaborate and proactively address risk. The supply collaboration is the second big focus, as I said. Activating alternate supply sources and shoring up inventories were second and third, respectively. But those are more what I would say agile supply chain, so that if any sudden risk comes through rippling through the supply chain, you can address them with those strategies. And 52% of the organizations are not using supply relationship management tools for supply collaboration, and that's the highest unexplored technology area. And I think right now I see, when I work with many of my clients, they are in the earliest parts of their journey to invest in that technology, if you will.
Fantastic insights. Yes, as you were saying that, from the craft perspective, we're always thinking about how are enterprises using digital technology to both generate information and then store it in a well-structured, accessible way. Because I think also, if you think back 10 or 15 or 20 years, where there was much less technology, we're talking papers in filing cabinets, we're talking about a lot of emails, phone calls, but things happening not really in a technology application. And we're seeing a lot of appetite and drive in enterprises to move and really have a structured tool to manage this. We're seeing exactly the same. Fantastic.
I'll just add that today a lot of companies are confusing technology with just access to risk data. And they're buying data from multiple sources, and they're buying risk alerts, if you will. And that is coming at them at a very fast pace, but they don't know what to do with it. How do you take all this data that is coming at you in terms of risk, understand the impact of each, create a risk portfolio that prioritizes that risk, and then ultimately, deploys the cross-functional resources to go address them collaboratively with the supplier. And as a metric, people are measuring what time it takes from an identification of a risk to a resolution of a risk. And nowadays, the leaders have compressed that into, hours, if not days and weeks.
Yeah. 100%.
And I'll just add to Vijay's point there, because it's a really pertinent one. which is, and we've all had these stories. Vijay would have had them as well. I've seen them as well, where you have organizations that say, hey, we just bought this fantastic software package, which is going to give us all the risk information we need, but actually it's had no impact on our supply resilience, right? What's happening here? And so the thing that we often help these organizations realize, and we've been doing this for quite a while, that no two organizations' supply resilience needs are exactly the same. In the years I've done this, there's no one size fits all answer. So buying a standard product off the shelf can be a really great tool, but it's one tool in a tool belt of process, people, and technology that you need to pull together to be able to build resilience, right? And so we're just seeing more and more organizations saying, hey, I bought this software package, why hasn't my resilience increased? Well, actually, you got to take a far more strategic approach to that. And so that's where we sort of work with organizations to help them see what are your unique requirements around resilience? How do you measure your resilience? And then how do we improve it? And perhaps a software package is one part of that tool, but it's not always the entire answer, right?
Yeah. It really is about developing a program to build resilience, isn't it? With those aspects you mentioned, there's data, there's people, there's process, and technology is a fantastic tool to tie all of that together and get to value and resilience faster than was possible before.
Right.
Fabulous. We've talked about specific risks and some of the technologies emerging. Let's talk a bit more, Abby, about specific disruptions that we've seen. I just want to double click in a little bit more, examples such as the pandemic, Suez Canal blockade, Ukraine war, which very much fit with those risks that you identified in our opening question. But I'd love to hear your perspective on why were traditional supply chains unprepared to respond, more effectively when those and other high-profile disruptions happened?
Look, another fantastic question, Ilya. Thank you. I think if you start with the basics when you start to think about a question like that, is that many organizations weren't prepared to deal with those sorts of disruptions because they actually hadn't done any resilience planning. So there was a lack of resilience planning. So that's the start point, right? Organizations hadn't necessarily even thought about resilience, 2 or 3 years ago. Now it's a hot topic in most organizations. But when a lot of these disruptions were happening, as I said, resilience was something that, happened in the side. It was all about efficiency and cost out. And that's an important metric as well, by the way. But we now see organizations thinking about both in balance, right? And so that lack of resilience planning was probably one of the biggest contributors to organizations not necessarily being prepared to respond to something like that. The second thing I would say that's quite closely connected to the lack of resilience planning is organizations weren't measuring their resilience, right? So no one knew how resilient or how unresilient they were, right? And so that was a topic that organizations have now started to pick up as well and say, well, it's not good enough just to have a resilience plan. We actually need to come up with some ways to measure how resilient we are, how are we going to respond to different scenarios, and that scenario planning is now happening, right? The second reason, I think, again, which builds on, or the third reason I should say, that builds on the first two, is that, as I said, organizations are far more complex. Supply chains are far more complex, as are organizations, and their supply chains are far more globalized, right? And they did not necessarily have visibility into those supply chains or supply networks, right? And so organizations knew very well who their direct tier 1 suppliers were, but they had very little understanding of who the tier 2 suppliers, the tier 3 suppliers, and the tier 4 suppliers were. And so when these disruptions happened, organizations said, well, we've got no suppliers directly in the impacted areas, and we're going to be completely fine. But as soon as you started to go down to tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4, there were many critical suppliers that these organizations had in those areas that might be disrupted, and they had little to no visibility of those, right? And so that was a second reason or the third reason, sorry, I should say, that organizations really were quite disrupted by this, right? The next one I would say is that, again, that focus on efficiency led to a lot of single sourcing or sole sourcing. And that was another area that we saw that as these events started to happen, organizations really started to highlight within their boardrooms that, hey, we've got a number of critical suppliers that are single sourced or sole sourced, right? And Vijay gave the example of the OEM he worked for. We worked with them together, and they realized just how many of their critical suppliers were single sourced. And if something happened to that one factory of that one supplier, the whole supply network sort of paused and broke down. And then the last thing, and again, we could talk for days on this topic, but the last thing I'll leave you with, and this is a really interesting concept that we've seen play out more and more, and it's a really fundamental one, is the starting to think of supply chains, but also starting to think of supply networks. It's not necessarily just your direct product suppliers that are going to be disrupted. It could be a services provider that they use off to the side that's been disrupted. And because of that services provider being disrupted, they can't supply you with the product you need, right? And so organizations are having to go through this mental shift of, rather than just thinking of my own product flow, I've got to think of my supply network, how it's interconnected. And that wasn't being done. And that's why a lot of these organizations that saw really, really high disruption during that period weren't necessarily prepared to deal with a lot of the issues that came their way. One little thing, we saw really, really big and long impacts, right?
Yeah. Fantastic answer, Abhi. So many aspects to it. Yeah, Vijay?
Yeah, I wanted to add to Abhi, right? So we touched upon this a little bit, but one other reason why they're unprepared to respond to disruption is lack of the governance, people, process, facilitate risk mitigation, right? So think about your organization, and many organizations have seen they have risk kind of dispersed across functions. So when risks come at you, curious, who owns this risk? Who is responsible for mitigating it? Is it engineering through engineering actions? Is it planning? Is it procurement? So really, it kind of dissipates and gets left alone, and then ultimately the impact is what they feel, and then they're too late to respond. So what organizations are doing, and in fact, this was highlighted during the semiconductor chip crisis. So one OEM that I was working with had no organization that was centralized that could really think about these risks, prioritize them, eliminate sort of the sub-tier supply chains, and then collaborate with the suppliers, including the tier twos that were the chip suppliers like the NXPs and OnSemis of the world. So instituting this crisis management team, which was a small team, having supply risk, as a C-level role where you have a supply chain risk officer now, and then having at their disposal the ability to pull on any of the cross-functional stakeholders to go mitigate that risk is how organizations are now setting themselves up. And that was not there in the past. The technology obviously is the enabler. So the lack of technology also was debilitating, and now there's a lot of investments being made. And that's a very important thing. You have to create the business case around lost sales, cost, lost brand and customer value, because unless you see that, you won't understand the ROI, because the I is also big here. Investing in understanding all the sub-tier suppliers that supply into you has to be done in a prioritized fashion, in an efficient fashion, in a cost-effective manner. To build enough intelligence, you require investment, and it's a journey. It's not done overnight. So you go on this journey for a month or a few years, but then at that time, you have everything you need to be able to rapidly respond, and the ROI is going to be significant.
Fantastic. Great. And we're going to talk a little bit in future about further defining resilience. And I'm going to be curious to ask what kind of KPIs that really prove the value you're seeing with the companies you're working with. So before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about the outlook and the risk horizon ahead of us. We talked about some of the disruptions we've seen in the recent past. But what kind of disruptions and particular supply chain threats do you believe will become more prevalent and pervasive in the upcoming years? Anything additional to the ones that we've already talked about? And how can organizations prepare for those?
Yeah, I think we talked about cybersecurity, climate-related disruptions, regulatory changes and transparency challenges, more regulations coming where you have to be compliant with forced labor and the likes. I think a couple others that we focus a lot on is really understanding commodity level risk. So if you think about copper, cobalt, lithium, these are all going to get scarce over time. And what we do as, and sort of data on this is not easily available. So we created some intelligence around building these reports and refreshing them every quarter. But ultimately, this has to be converted into data that can be ingested that really understands sort of the raw material dependency that you have, which is becoming scarce, to the parts that are supplied into your products. And understanding that dependency and then making sure you have, and these are not going to happen tomorrow, right? They're all happening in 5 years, 7 years down the line. So you have to think about it today. And if you look at the likes of Tesla, for example, in the automotive industry, they're making, they're driving relationships and long-term agreements with the mines that are mining all the materials required to make batteries. So that's how far, people are starting to think about, longer-term ability to address raw material shortages. We talked about social and labor issues. And the only other thing that I would talk about is the technology adoption challenges that are going to occur. There are many emerging technologies like AI, blockchain, automation, etc. And these can introduce a lot of implementation challenges. There could be gaps to skills, and then there could be potential disruptions as companies transition and implement all of these technologies. And so how do you get ahead of that is another risk I would be concerned about.
Terrific. So we've really covered a lot of ground. Abby, you want to add something there?
Yeah, look, I might just add very quickly, right? There's one other that I think organizations are now starting to become aware of through either regulation, through a compliance requirement, or just through thinking about the right thing to do, which is the impact of Scope 3 emissions on their supply chains, right? So thinking about the impact of sustainability on supply chains and supply networks is starting to become more and more critical. And how these may disrupt your supply chains into the future is something that's also prevalent, and organizations are now starting to get their head around. But I think just to really drive home Vijay's point about, risks are changing and they are more and more prevalent, is that in 2024 alone, we've seen impacts on the Suez Canal. We've seen impacts at the same time on the Panama Canal. We've seen impacts through flooding in Malaysia. We've seen the winter storm quite recently and power outages in the US East Coast. This is all in the space of half a month, right? And so these disruptions are here to stay. Like, we are no longer necessarily as disrupted by COVID as we were 2-3 years ago. But since that time, we have seen the prevalence and the duration of disruptions grow. And so we've moved on from the pandemic, but there are other disruptions that organizations need to be aware of. And these are ever changing day in, day out.
Fantastic. So let's round out before we go to a couple of questions from the audience here. I want to just double click a little bit further into this key watchword we've had here, which is resilience, and ask, what are you seeing about how companies are defining it, measuring it? Abby, you raised that point earlier, and then Vijay talked about how to drive the change that you need in the organization. You need to show results, don't you? ROI, and so it comes to KPIs. Are you seeing a lot of harmony and consistency in how organizations are starting to measure and define resilience for themselves, or is there a diverse range? Abby, let's start with you.
Yeah, thank you. Look, as I said, I think earlier in one of the questions, which was there are no two organizations that I have worked with that have had exactly the same way of managing resilience, right? So all organizations have different resilience goals for different products in different ways or different services, right? However, when you start to think about it in quite a structured manner, many of those goals do tend to come up to, and we've got a framework that we use to help organizations measure their resistance and then measure their journey on growing that resistance over time, right? Sorry, and resilience over time. And I should say that the way we think about it is the ability to resist shock and how quickly, so for how long you can do that, and the ability to recover from a shock and how long it takes you to recover from that shock, right? And if you start to think of it in that way, there are ways you can actually measure the resilience of your business, and you can measure the impact of certain initiatives and start to look at the ROI that those initiatives will give you in being able to resist shocks for longer and recover from shocks quicker, right? And minimize the impact of those shocks. So those are sort of the key areas that we sort of look at as we start to help an organization go on that resilience journey and start to think about, what is it that we need to do from a resilience perspective to understand where we are and figure out where we need to get to. Once they've started to do that measurement, then, I'm really doing this at a very high level, we tend to think that there's a few-step approach to actually growing that resilience and measuring that resistance and recovery timeframe. The first and most critical part to that is being able to understand your extended multi-tier supply network, right? So illuminating your supply network and understanding who's in that supply network at tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, both in an autonomous way, so you can get a really quick answer to get 70% of the answer, and then through some manual mapping as well, which can be complementary to the fully automated process, right? We then, propose organizations are continually monitoring for risk. As I just said in the last question that you posed to us, is that these risks are here, they're more prevalent, they're more regular, and so being able to measure them, to monitor for them is really important. But monitoring risks alone is not powerful. Understanding how those risks are going to impact your business specifically is where the magic is, right? And so that's also how we think about doing things slightly differently to some of the others out there, is not just measuring and monitoring for risk, but also understanding exactly how it's going to impact your business. And that little tweak is a really, really important one. And then the last one that we help organizations think about is what's your ability to collaborate with your extended supply chain and act on some of these risks, right? How quickly can you act, and can you act quicker than some of the others out there? And does that put you in a better competitive position, and so on and so forth? And obviously, as Vijay said 2 or 3 times through the discussion, and it's a really important one, all of that is underpinned by having the right people, process, and tech, right? And so measuring that and how strong your people, process, and tech framework is another way we help organizations think about where they are on their resilience journey. Vijay, anything to add?
Yeah. I was going to say, many people, many organizations can find it daunting to go on this journey, right? Where do I start? I have thousands of suppliers in my supply base. So I think the first thing is to take a step back and prioritize it, right? So you want to look at the suppliers in terms of the business criticality. Are they strategic? Are they single sourced? Do they have a lot of spend? Are they supplying into your flagship products on one axis? On the other axis, and this is where a lot of data exists around external risk, around financial, operational, cybersecurity, and ESG and the like. There's so much risk data. So get the risk data, and all the business critical suppliers and also external indicators that are saying they're high risk are the ones you want to start first. And so in addition to what Abhi said around resilience, one factor he talked about is visibility into the sub-tier supply chain. I also think about flexibility. How quickly can you adapt to disruptions and switch to alternate suppliers, right? The ability to, for a single line to manufacture multiple products. Tesla, for example, was able to reprogram their chips through just software and then use it for different applications. So that's a great example of the flexibility that they showed versus the traditional automotive OEMs. Collaboration is another one where you develop a trust-based relationship with the supply chain, and how well are you exchanging data in terms of forecast versus supply, inventory positions, and the like. And that is another factor. And then the last piece is around control. So the ability to implement processes and policies that prevent disruptions, right? So having the right quality, safety, on-time delivery, regulatory compliance, et cetera, those aspects. And I would say when you step back and then think about metrics to measure all of this, one is obviously kind of the ROI and outcome based. How much of your bills of materials that are being supplied have exposure to lost sales, high costs, customer brand disruption? You need to really understand that piece. Then you take it to the next level that says outcome-based metrics around how fast are you able to resolve risk, how fast are you able to identify a risk, those types of metrics. And then you get into tactical and operational metrics along those 4 dimensions I talked about: visibility, flexibility, collaboration, and control.
Fantastic. I can imagine a very powerful dashboard envisioning that's showing all of this. And it's exciting to think about because that, of course, is it's so new. So much of this information is still siloed and in non-digital formats or just in people's heads, right? Fantastic. Well, really appreciate that discussion on those questions. And I wanted to open it up to the audience. And we've had here in the chat a couple of terrific questions. Some of them touch on areas we've discussed and will allow us just to go a little bit deeper in our last few minutes here. So, Abhi, I know that the sustainability topic is near to your heart, and we got a question here. Resilience is one thing, but our customers are also increasingly concerned with sustainability. How can we balance the two, or do we have to choose between them?
Yeah. I mean, that's a fantastic question from the audience, right? It is a really important topic, sustainability, as we look into the future, right? I mean, and just from a base level, right, we want to leave the planet in a place that our kids can enjoy it and their kids can enjoy it. And it's important to think about it from that perspective, right? I mean, personally, and we here don't see resilience and sustainability being at odds with each other, right? They are one and the same thing. If we can't think about how to do what we do in a sustainable way across our supply chain, there's not going to be any supply chain left to do the things that we want to do, right? And so to think of one or the other, or the fact that they come at opposing costs is not necessarily the right way of thinking about it. If you want a resilient supply chain, you must also have a sustainable supply chain. I'll give you a few examples, right? As we start to think about Scope 3 emissions, I touched on this earlier, there are going to be regulations around organizations understanding their Scope 3. And so to do that, Scope 3 emissions cannot be understood by looking at your Tier 1 suppliers. To understand your Scope 3 emissions cradle to gate, you need to be able to understand who are the Tier 2s, who are the Tier 3s, who are the Tier 4s, where are my emission hotspots, what should I do about them? And that's in fact one of the things that we're helping organizations through the use of Illuminate and Supply Horizon, the platform that we've built, right? So to think of one as an opposing force to the other is not necessarily the right way. To think of them both as hand in glove and that we need to be thinking about both going forward into the future is the right way to think about both resilience and sustainability and how they come together, right? One final point that I'll add, though, and it's an important one, is that, and this perhaps was the basis of the question, is as we start to run to more sustainable energy and we start to think about the types of products we need to build sustainable energy infrastructure, the entire world is competing for the same set of resources that are available around the world, the same raw materials, the same products, the same services, so on and so forth. So that does put strain on the supply network, and it does bring down the resilience of that supply network because we're all competing for the same product. But it's not that to grow resilience, you have to be less sustainable. Actually, you have to think about both in balance.
Both in balance. Fantastic. Vijay, question for you from the audience. What activities should we prioritize when coming up with a plan to improve our supply chain's resilience?
So as you think about the activities, as I said, it can seem daunting, but if you approach it first in a prioritized way, where you look at business criticality and risk, and then, or invest heavily in the more strategic high-risk suppliers in terms of really understanding, visibility, getting risk indicators and alerts on all of them on a continuous basis, real time, and then setting up collaboration platforms so that you can proactively address risks with them, right? And then you can, reduce your investments as you go to the other suppliers. So the three activities that I would recommend, and we're seeing this, which will help kind of really address the metric around identification to resolution, but not only that, but also shift you from being reactive to a proactive organization in addressing risk. Number one is illuminating the supply chain, and we've talked about this a lot. So there's a lot of data out there, gathering the commercial artifacts, the bills of materials, the suppliers, and building that intelligence out using technologies like we have as we've built our solutions around AI and natural language processing to refine all of that data, take the noise out so that it's meaningful and can be used and refreshed on an ongoing basis. And screening this list and almost creating a digital twin of your supply chain is extremely important. Do it for your most impactful suppliers, then work your way down as needed. Go as deep as needed as well. All categories don't need to go all the way to tier 7. So there's a balance of kind of cost versus effectiveness of elimination. The second piece is sensing. Identifying and assessing the potential supply disruptions is extremely important. This has to be real time, but just subscribing to data sources and looking at multiple sources, that one may provide you financial, another one ESG, another cybersecurity. But how do you put all this together and evaluate a comprehensive risk score for suppliers is going to be important, number one. Number two is, what do you do with those alerts and understand the impact to your business, prioritize those risks to create a portfolio, and then measure the impact through the metrics we just discussed is another capability you need to build. And then the third piece is acting on these risks. So how do you prioritize the risks, prioritize the actions, and then call to action all the cross-functional resources to go mitigate that risk across planning, sourcing, manufacturing, and procurement. And engaging these folks in the mitigation plans, bring them possibly on a collaboration platform where you can exchange information like verification of the risk and risk mitigation strategies with not only the tier 1 supplier, but the choked sub-tier supplier that can be also brought on this platform, will really compress that time to resolution and get you going.
Fantastic plan. All right, Abby, we've got time for just one more briefly. I think this builds on what Vijay just said, but audience member writes, some disruptions are impossible to predict. Are we forced to take a reactionary approach? What do we do if an unforeseen event happens again? Just give a quick answer on that.
Yeah, look, I'll keep it nice and brief. I know we're getting very close to time. Look, Vijay touched on what are the things you need to do to build the resilience in your supply chain, right? And the answer, the very quick answer to that question is being prepared, having that visibility, continuously sensing for those risks and understanding the impact of those risks on your business does allow you to react, right? So yes, the answer to the question is there are going to be risks that we need to react to. The simple answer to that is you need to react quicker than your competition. It's that simple. There is no magic bullet that when a certain part of the world that supplies, I'm going to use the same example Vijay used around semiconductors. If a certain part of the world that supplies a lot of semiconductors is, for whatever reason, out of the picture, being able to react quicker than your competition and collect as much buffer stock as you can, or already knowing that that's a really important part for you and therefore you're going to have buffer stock of that beyond your daily needs anyway. Those are the sorts of things you can put in place to deal with risks. But yes, the question is a very good one because there will absolutely be some risks that we will need to be reactionary to. Not every risk we can manage proactively, right? And having that strong base to start from, having the visibility, the risk monitoring, and the ability to collaborate with your suppliers is what will allow you to act quicker than your competition. And if you can do that, then you will likely weather that storm for longer than others potentially will be able to.
I'll just add one thing that we may not have talked about to that is this communication and stakeholder management. A lot of times these risks come through it just dissipates and no one addresses it, or one area is pointing to the other saying, I thought you were taking care of it, right? So communicating with the key stakeholders, customers, suppliers, internal cross-functional teams, and being transparent about the situation, the potential impacts, and the steps you're going to take to address the disruption is going to be extremely important.
Fantastic steps. Wonderful advice and recommendations. Vijay, Abby, thank you so much for this tremendous discussion. For everyone watching, thank you so much for spending your time with us. One offer I'm delighted to make here is a complimentary risk assessment for your organization, jointly conducted by Craft and Deloitte. If you'd be interested in that, exploring many of the topics we've discussed here, please respond to the follow-up email you will receive after this webinar. And thank you again for listening in. Let me now hand it back to Annie.
All right, what a fantastic discussion. I'd really like to thank our speakers, Vijay, Avneet, and Ilya, for sharing your insights and your expertise with us. And I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us today. Today's webinar will be available on demand, so you will receive an email soon with the link so you can rewatch it or share it with your colleagues. We hope to see you again soon. Have a great day.